talk about fears. Let's talk about love. Yeah, I got fears.
The months after Brian Shaffer's disappearance stretched into years, and the world around him moved forward even as his family remained frozen in April 2006. The seasons changed across Columbus, students graduated, bars opened and closed, lives began and ended, but for Randy Shaffer and his younger son Derek, time was measured only by the absence of Brian. Every holiday came with an empty chair, every birthday was a reminder of what had been stolen. Their grief had no grave to visit, no marker to hold on to. It was grief without form, unending, raw. Randy devoted himself entirely to the search. He became a familiar figure on the sidewalks of Columbus, distributing flyers long after the case had faded from the nightly news. He called detectives weekly, sometimes daily, asking for updates, pushing for new angles, refusing to let the case sink into cold storage. He met with psychics, consulted private investigators, posted on forums, and drove long hours to chase rumors. To friends, he seemed consumed, hollowed out by the loss of his wife and the disappearance of his son in the span of just weeks. But Randy never gave up hope. He often said that if he could just find Brian, if he could just know the truth, he could live with it. What he could not live with was the silence. Derek carried his own burden differently. As the younger brother, he had grown up with Brian as his protector, his guide, his companion. Now he was left in a world where his protector was gone and his father was slowly breaking under the weight of grief. Derek rarely spoke publicly about his pain, but those close to him saw it. The fatigue in his eyes, the heaviness in his shoulders. He tried to live, to work, to keep some sense of normalcy, but the disappearance was always there, pressing in from the edges of his life. He loved his father and tried to be strong for him, but there were nights when the silence of the Shaffer house was unbearable, when he would close his eyes and hear Brian's laugh, only to wake to emptiness. Alexis, the woman who had once imagined a future with Brian, found herself trapped between mourning and denial. She kept his memory alive with vigils, interviews, and prayers. She never removed the bracelet he had given her, never stopped wearing the necklace that carried a piece of him. For a long time, she refused to date anyone else, believing with a loyalty that astonished even her friends that Brian was alive somewhere, waiting. Years passed, and she remained single, a symbol of devotion in the face of impossible odds. To the public, she was the grieving girlfriend who never stopped believing. But privately, she struggled with despair, the crushing loneliness of nights where she reached for a phone call that never came. The police investigation slowed with time, but never stopped entirely. Detectives revisited old evidence, checked for new technology that might yield answers, interviewed new witnesses who came forward. But nothing ever broke. The surveillance footage was reviewed again and again, and still the same truth stared back. Brian entered the Ugly Tuna Saloona, and no camera ever captured him leaving. The exits had been watched, the stairwells checked, the building scoured. It remained the heart of the puzzle, a mystery that seemed to taunt logic as years passed. Brian's case became a cornerstone of internet sleuthing culture. On forums like Web Sleuths and Reddit, strangers pored over every detail, scrutinizing timelines, maps, and witness statements. They debated the reliability of Clint's account, dissected the ringing of Brian's phone, speculated about construction sites, tunnels, conspiracies. Some believed he had been murdered inside the bar and smuggled out in a way no one could imagine. Others clung to the idea that he had walked away from his life, that he was sipping drinks on some beach under a new name. The case became folklore in digital spaces, a modern ghost story passed between those fascinated by the dark corners of reality. Through it all, Randy remained steadfast. He lit candles for Brian, spoke to reporters, begged for information. He never let the world forget his son. But tragedy, relentless and cruel, found him again. In September 2008, a windstorm swept through Ohio, toppling trees and tearing power lines. Randy was outside in his yard when a branch fell, striking him fatally. Just like that, The man who had carried the torch for his missing son was gone, leaving Derek the last surviving member of the immediate Shaffer family. Friends and neighbors wept not just for Randy's death, but for the cruel irony of it. A man who had endured so much, waiting for answers that never came, taken suddenly by an act of nature. At Randy's funeral, the absence of Brian was louder than ever. Derek stood alone as the last of his family, his grief deepened by the knowledge that his father had died without ever knowing the truth. Alexis, still wearing the necklace Brian had given her, stood beside him, her own face streaked with tears. Together, they grieved not just Randy, but the family that had been torn apart by loss upon loss. In the years that followed, Derek tried to build a life while carrying the shadow of the case. He married, worked, and attempted to heal, but interviews with him revealed the depth of his scars. He spoke candidly about how the case had destroyed trust and friendships, how accusations and suspicions had left wounds, how he had been forced to live with questions that could never be answered. The disappearance of his brother was not just an event but a lifelong sentence. Alexis eventually moved forward too, though it was not easy. Time pushed her gently toward acceptance, though she never stopped believing in some small corner of her heart that Brian might still be out there. She remarried years later, but friends said she always carried Brian with her. He was the love who vanished, the wound that never fully closed. As technology advanced, police revisited the case. They checked Brian's DNA against unidentified remains, tested new facial recognition tools, followed up on fresh tips generated by documentaries and podcasts. Yet every road led to the same place: silence. The Ugly Tuna Saloona eventually closed, its neon lights darkened, but the ghost of that night remained. Even as the building changed, the legend endured. The case became one of the most famous missing person mysteries in America, often referenced in lists of the most baffling disappearances. It embodied the fear of the impossible. How could a man simply vanish in a world of cameras, witnesses, and digital trails? It was a reminder that life was fragile, that certainty could evaporate in an instant. For Derek, for Alexis, for the extended Shaffer family, the wound never healed. For internet sleuths, the case became an endless puzzle. For Columbus, it became part of the city's folklore. And for the world, Brian Shaffer became a symbol of the unknowable, the young doctor in training who walked into a bar and never walked out. Even today, nearly 2 decades later, his face still appears in digital spaces, his name whispered in podcasts, his story retold to new audiences who cannot believe that such a thing could happen. The FBI continues to list him as missing. Posters still float around online. Hope still flickers in corners, though dimmer now, tempered by time. And yet the central question remains, untouched by years of searching. What happened to Brian Shaffer in the early hours of April 1st, 2006? Did he find a way to slip away, to live out the dream of escape he so often mentioned? Or was he the victim of something darker, something hidden in the shadows of that Columbus night? No one knows. Perhaps no one ever will. But his absence speaks louder than words, echoing across the lives of those who loved him and the imaginations of those who seek to understand. He is the son who never came home, the brother who vanished, the boyfriend whose last phone call became a haunting memory. He is the man who walked into the Ugly Tuna Saloona and was never seen again. And until the day truth surfaces, Brian Shaffer will remain what he has been since that night. A question without an answer, a mystery without an ending, a reminder of how easily a life can slip beyond the grasp of the world. Brian Shaffer's disappearance did more than devastate his family and confound the Columbus police. Over the years, it evolved into a story that transcended its original crime report, rippling outward into a cultural phenomenon, a modern legend. Whispered in dorm rooms, discussed in criminology classes, and dissected in countless podcasts, documentaries, and online forums. It became the archetype of the unsolvable disappearance, the case that illustrated the thin line between presence and absence, between a life lived and a life erased in an instant. To understand the grip it still holds, one must return to the man himself. Brian was not a shadowy figure, not a recluse, not someone living at the fringes of society. He was the opposite: vibrant, charismatic, well-liked, moving through life with the kind of promise that draws people in. He laughed easily, loved deeply, and dreamed openly. He was a son mourning his mother, a brother protective of his sibling, a boyfriend building a future with Alexis, a medical student pushing through grueling hours with a restless desire for more. He was, in short, a man who embodied both potential and vulnerability. Those who knew him often spoke of his contradictions. He could be deeply serious one moment, poring over medical texts, and then carefree the next, daydreaming aloud about running away to an island bar. He carried the weight of responsibility, but also the spark of rebellion. He was a healer in training who privately longed for escape. These contradictions became the fuel for endless theories after he vanished. The theory of voluntary disappearance lingered the longest. Could Brian, crushed by grief and burned out by medical school, have staged his own vanishing? He had the intelligence, the resourcefulness, and perhaps even the motive. His musings about a beach bar were not secrets. He spoke of them often, half in jest, half in longing. The possibility that he had simply walked away, leaving behind his old life, haunted those left behind. Yet this theory raised its own impossible questions. How could he have planned such a disappearance without leaving a trace? His bank accounts remained untouched, his phone went silent, his passport unused. To disappear so completely in the age of digital trails was an extraordinary feat if he had done it. He had done it perfectly. The theory of foul play remained just as compelling. Some believed Brian had been lured out of the bar by someone he trusted, harmed, and hidden in a way that escaped cameras. Others believed he never left the building, that something happened inside those walls, and that somehow, impossibly, he had been smuggled out or concealed. The searches of the Ugly Tuna disproved this again and again, yet the idea persisted, fueled by the sheer impossibility of the footage. The suspicion cast on Clint Florence, the friend who refused a polygraph, never fully faded either. Though no evidence tied him to harm, the refusal became a permanent stain, a question mark that left the public divided. The accident theory drew in others. Perhaps Brian had stumbled into an unsecured construction site, fallen, and been lost. Perhaps he had wandered the city, dazed, and met misfortune in some hidden corner. Perhaps his body was somewhere just beyond sight, waiting to be found. But as years passed and searches expanded, these theories too faltered. No remains, no evidence, no accident scene ever appeared. The sheer lack of evidence became the story itself. In an era of surveillance cameras and digital footprints, Brian's disappearance represented something unthinkable, the possibility that someone could still vanish in plain sight. It gnawed at the modern illusion of safety, at the belief that technology made us traceable, knowable, secure. If Brian could disappear from a bar under cameras, then anyone could vanish from anywhere. His story became a symbol of uncertainty, a reminder that the world was not as mapped as we believed. The rise of social media and internet sleuthing ensured Brian's case never faded into obscurity. On forums, strangers became obsessed, building timelines, analyzing footage, debating every detail. They argued over the angle of his smile on the surveillance video, the possibility of blind spots in the bar, the meaning of the phone that rang. Days later, they theorized wildly, some suggesting secret identities, others hinting at elaborate conspiracies. Each new generation of online investigators discovered Brian's case as if, for the first time, captivated by the impossibility of it. Podcasts dedicated episodes, true crime YouTube channels recounted the story in cinematic tones, documentaries revisited the footage with dramatic reenactments. Brian became less a man and more a myth, his absence fueling an industry of speculation. For Derek, the surviving brother, this obsession was a double-edged sword. On one hand, the attention kept the case alive, ensured his brother was not forgotten. On the other, it turned Brian into a puzzle piece for strangers to move around, often at the expense of the family's peace. Suspicions aimed at friends, at Derek himself, at anyone connected to the case, reopened wounds again and again. It was a strange kind of immortality, one born of tragedy, where the person you loved was forever frozen in their disappearance. The cultural impact of Brian's disappearance extended further. Nightlife safety became a topic of debate in Columbus, with parents warning their children, "Remember Brian Shaffer." Students at Ohio State spoke of him as a ghost on campus, a cautionary tale whispered during late-night walks home. The Ugly Tuna Saloona became infamous, its name forever linked not to laughter and neon, but to mystery and absence. When it eventually closed, some said it was haunted, not by spirits, but by the memory of a young man who had walked through its doors and never walked out. Nearly 2 decades later, the story remains unsolved, and perhaps that is why it endures. Every year, anniversaries bring fresh articles, fresh discussions, fresh pain for those who knew him. The FBI still lists Brian Shaffer as missing. His image, slightly aged by time and digitally created age-progressed photos, circulates online. Somewhere, someone knows the truth, people say. Somewhere, there is an answer waiting. But so far, silence remains the only response. The story of Brian Shaffer endures because it embodies the terror of the unknown. It asks questions that defy closure. How can a man vanish without a trace in a crowded bar under surveillance cameras? How can grief and hope coexist in the absence of evidence? How does a family carry on when they lose not only a loved one, but the certainty of knowing what happened to them? These questions linger, echoing through every retelling, every theory, every late-night discussion on forums where strangers type in the dark, searching for a truth that may never come. Brian Shaffer was more than a mystery. He was a son who adored his mother, a brother who protected Derek, a boyfriend who told Alexis he loved her on the night he vanished. He was a medical student with dreams of saving lives and fantasies of beach bars and sunsets. He was human, complicated, vibrant, real. And perhaps that is what makes his disappearance so unbearable. He was not meant to be a myth, but he became one anyway as long as his body is not found. As long as no clear answer emerges, Brian Shaffer will remain the man who haunts the edge of certainty, the ghost in the surveillance footage, the reminder that even in a world of cameras and technology, people can still vanish, and sometimes, mysteries remain mysteries.